Greetings to everyone, and welcome to the annual meeting of the Consortium of Universities for Global Health and to our plenary debate session. I'm Tom Quinn, Director of the Center of Global Health at Johns Hopkins University and Associate Director for International Research at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases of the NIH. I will be the host and moderator of today's debate, which promises to be informative relative to global health and exciting as we hear two outstanding speakers on one very important topic of our time. This will also be interactive so that you, the audience, have a say in where you stand on this important topic. A few words on framing today's resolution. Over the past 2 years and 3 months, we have witnessed a global pandemic of SARS-CoV-2 of enormous magnitude that has affected every country of the world and basically brought the world to an economic and social standstill with lockdowns, mandatory restrictions on movement, political debates over preventative measures, and basic turmoil for the past 2 years. The pandemic itself caused undue suffering globally, infecting 481 million people as of today, with 6 million deaths in 2 years, millions of hospitalizations, and substantial medical costs. And yet, technology and human spirit and endeavor came through with an answer within months of recognition of this escalating pandemic. The pathogen was sequenced within literally a month, with vaccine development following, early trials to prove safety and efficacy, and then approval and eventual distribution of multiple safe and effective vaccines at unprecedented speed. To date, 11 billion, that's billion with a B, doses of vaccine have been distributed, with 64% of the world population estimated to have received at least one dose. But controversy continues to swirl about vaccine policy, distributions, availability, manufacturing, donations, cost, acceptability, and mandatory practices. And now the question of boosters: who, when, and where. For example, only 14.5% of people residing in low-income countries have received one dose. We could have allocated most of the annual meeting to all of these topics. And in fact, we already have had some great sessions on these very topics, like this morning's plenary on vaccine hesitancy and distribution and advocacy in yesterday's session. Because of the global importance of these vaccines and to guide us into future pandemics, we're hosting this debate on vaccine distribution priorities. So we framed the following debate question: be it resolved, global priorities should supersede national priorities in vaccinating people during a pandemic. To guide our debaters on whether you all stand on this topic, we will take an anonymous poll on this resolution before we hear our debaters to get an estimate of whether you agree with this resolution or do you disagree. At the end of the debate, we'll repeat the poll to see if our discussants have swayed your opinion at all. We'll also open up the Q&A session for open discussion, which I'll moderate in case you want to express your opinion or challenge any of the issues addressed by the debaters. So I'm going to ask Cassidy, our technician, can we open up the poll at this time? Can we show it on the screens? Okay, I'm hearing that it is open. People are voting. I'm going to just wait to try and get a good assessment. And then I'm going to ask Cassidy, our technician, to give us the results. She's telling me panelists can't vote. So I'm excluded from this, but that's appropriate. Okay, if everyone's had a chance to vote, then Cassidy, can you? Okay, here we go. I don't know how many people can see this. I can see the results. Again, I'll repeat the question. Be it resolved, global priorities should supersede national priorities in vaccinating people during a pandemic. So 77% of those who voted have voted yes, and 23% have voted no, i.e. they favor the national priority first before the global priority. So I'm going to stop sharing that. And then I want to do introductions. We'll move into the actual debate. See if I can close that. There we go. So first, now to introduce our esteemed debaters. Arguing for the resolution is Fatima Hassan, well-known human rights lawyer and social justice activist, founder of the Health Justice Initiative in South Africa. She's the former executive director of the Open Society Foundation for South Africa, heading that foundation for 6 years. And she has dedicated her professional life to defending and promoting human rights in South Africa, especially in the field of HIV/AIDS, where she has worked for the AIDS Law Project and has acted on behalf of the Treatment Action Campaign in many of its legal cases. She has her bachelor's degree and law degree from the University of Witwatersrand and from Duke University. She's clerked at the Constitutional Court of South Africa. She's served on the boards of the Wrath Foundation, Médecins Sans Frontières Without Borders, the International Treatment Preparedness Coalition, South African Council for Medical Schemes. Currently serving on the board of Global Witness and recipient of several fellowships and awards, including the Franklin Thomas Constitutional Court Fellowship and the Tom and Bernstein Distinguished Human Rights Fellowship at Yale University School of Law. She's published and written on issues related to social justice and HIV/AIDS access to medicines. I want to introduce our other debater arguing against the resolution is Dr. George Rutherford, who's the Salvatore Pablo Lucia Professor of Epidemiology, Preventive Medicine, Pediatrics, and History, and head of the Division of Infectious Diseases and Global Epidemiology in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at University of California, San Francisco. George was educated at Stanford University and Duke University School of Medicine. He's board certified in pediatrics and general preventative medicine and public health. His expertise is in the epidemiology and control of communicable diseases of public health significance, with a particular focus on HIV, Ebola, Zika in low and middle income countries. George serves as an advisor to the CDC and the World Health Organization. He co-chairs the UCSF Chancellor's Global Disaster Assistance Committee, which was set up early in the 2014 West African Ebola epidemic. He's been involved in the public health response to SARS-CoV-2 since its earliest days of the pandemic, and has served on the campus, city, state, and national levels in the COVID response. So, two fantastic debaters, and without further ado, I'm going to hand over the microphone over to Fatima Hassan. It's all yours.
Thank you. And I've been told I have 7 minutes. I'm going to try and share with you a few reasons why I think we have to vote, in an affirmative way, because I think there's 4 main reasons for me. The first is that this resolution is not a hypothetical. It's a question that is occupying the minds of global leaders and people who are in charge of multiple initiatives around the world to try and vaccinate millions of people, billions of people in this particular pandemic. And for me, in the global south, it really is the difference between life and death. The first main reason why I think it's the correct proposal is because it makes public health sense. It's a good public health strategy to vaccinate those who are at risk globally before you vaccinate people who are least at risk or people who are young or not at risk, ahead of people who are healthcare workers, for example, or people who are elderly in my parts of the world. The second reason is that it's linked to this idea of equity in a pandemic. And I think it's morally necessary and it's morally required. And the third is it advances the agenda of human rights in health and the ability for everyone everywhere to benefit from the fruits of scientific knowledge and the advancement that Tom talked about. And it also reflects the position of the World Health Organization in this particular pandemic. And you remember that it was declared a public health emergency of international concern. And so we'll come back to the issue of geography shortly. The first, if we want to advance this argument about what makes public health sense, the first is that obviously it's a global pandemic affecting everybody everywhere at the same time. And there has to be some kind of realization that no border can protect people from the full consequences of the pandemic. So if you're going to make a public health inroad into trying to manage the pandemic, and what we've seen has been the total opposite in the last 2 years, then you've got to actually have a global allocation framework in order to make sure that when there's scarcity, which obviously in our view as activists, we believe that the scarcity is artificial, and when there's limited supplies, there has to be a framework for global allocation based on global need. And initially, the World Health Organization said that that should be healthcare workers first, and then people who are elderly and people with comorbidities. And obviously, as Tom indicated, of the 11 billion doses that have been given out in the world, the majority has actually gone to countries in the global north. Only 14% of those 11 billion doses have actually gone to lower income countries. And the resulting impact of that has obviously been, from a public health point of view, multiple variants, but worse has been a gross form of vaccine nationalism and vaccine apartheid. So I believe that if you vote, against this particular resolution, you're actually saying that vaccine apartheid and vaccine nationalism is okay in the context of a global pandemic. The second issue, obviously, is that when you have a global supply crisis, like I've mentioned earlier, you need a global allocation response, unless, of course, you are able to share the knowledge and share the technology to allow national production. So in the absence of widespread national production across the world, it makes it very difficult to actually justify a framework where national priorities are first met over basically, a framework of global allocation. And this is playing out also in the allocation of booster shots, where we have this really perverse situation in the world where booster shots are being administered in richer parts of the world. And in my continent, people haven't even received a first shot or a second shot. At the end of 2021, only 1 in 4 healthcare workers in Africa on the front line had actually, been able to benefit, and I use that word quite guardedly, but to benefit from a vaccine. So the uneven allocation, I think, stems from this idea that you protect your own first, that vaccine nationalism is palatable and is acceptable in a pandemic. And the number of unofficial death toll is 20 million deaths in the space of 2 years, $13 trillion in economic losses, I think suggests that the entire way in which we basically view the distribution of scarce supplies, artificial as it may be, and the control of vaccine production has to be re-looked at. I want to tell you a story in my last few minutes, which I think perfectly illustrates this idea of vaccine nationalism and why global leaders in parts of the richer north think that this is okay. When South Africa was facing wave 3 in the middle of last year in 2021, and we had no vaccine supplies except for a limited number for some of our healthcare workers, and we were waiting for supplies from some of the largest vaccine manufacturers who had controlled the means of production and who had been prioritizing supplies for some of the richer countries in the world. We had a G7 leader, President Macron, and I'm just using this as an example, who flew into South Africa on a presidential jet private plane to have a meeting with President Ramaphosa to announce various deals. And on his plane, while I was waiting for my vaccine and my family was waiting for that vaccine and my mom was waiting for her vaccine, he brought 2,000 supplies of the J&J vaccine. And he gave those vaccines only to French nationals living in South Africa. So if you were a French national living in South Africa, any other part of Africa, special military aircrafts or presidential planes were being used to basically bring those vaccines to you while the people who were most at risk in my own country and while all of us were waiting for vaccines. And that is the consequence of vaccine nationalism and apartheid, where you say that that kind of system of prioritizing people based on their nationality and geography in a pandemic is acceptable and palatable. And frankly, that is something that is so distasteful, is so perverse, but it lends itself to this idea that, you know, prioritizing national priorities over global priorities from a public health point of view, from an equity point of view, from a moral point of view, and from a human rights point of view is okay and can be justified. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fatima. Right on time as well. So I'm going to turn it over to George, 7 minutes.
Thanks a lot, Tom. Not only do I not have the moral high ground, but I'm debating a lawyer. So that was, you know, I got sort of set up here. I feel like I should have on a, you know, be dressed like the Monopoly guy with a top hat and swallowtail coat. So let me give you a kind of a counterweight to this. First of all, like it or not, we live in a capitalist society, and the money follows the market. The money for research and development, the money for production, the money for distribution follows the market. The markets are in high income countries who can pay for the vaccine. The United States, to speak directly to the point about the US, has put inordinate amounts of research and development dollars into vaccine development, including all the early work on mRNA vaccines and much of the work on adenovirus vaccines, although I will point out that a lot of that's been spread across the EU and India as well. But you know, the bottom line is if there's no market, there's no R&D, there's no production, there's no stimulus to produce these vaccines. And in order for there to be a market, people need to buy it. In this case, these vaccines were bought by the US government, acting on behalf of the states in the United States, who do have the authority for public health, for protecting the public health. And the federal government is acting on behalf of the states, as I think it's properly so. We can talk about public health emergencies of international concern, but I don't believe the United States is under any obligation to provide vaccines, either through the international health regulations or through the WHO charter to other countries, and does so both bilaterally and multilaterally as essentially a public good. The other thing that I'd like to emphasize, and again, I could totally concede that Fatima has the moral high ground here. The other thing I'll concede is that much of the world's economy is driven by the United States and the EU's economies. If those were allowed to collapse, and by not trying to protect those populations, first, we would be in a worldwide depression with even worse outcomes. That's a very hard judgment to make. It's a very difficult sort of way to weigh the world, but at some point you have to protect the engines that drive the worldwide economy. I can't cite numbers for you. I can't cite figures, But if the US economy and the Western European economy were to collapse because of COVID and not having people being able to go to work to manufacture things, and run the global economies, the world would be in deep trouble. And you can just see what's gone on in China, where there's been an undercommitment to a certain extent to vaccination, with the resulting decrease in production, the huge backups for products that are coming out of China that are looking for world markets. The other thing is that we do have a mechanism, meaning the world has a mechanism for high income countries to provide vaccines to low and middle income countries, and that's called COVAX. I think that from the United States standpoint, we've given or promised 1.2 billion doses. The EU has promised 471 million doses. China has donated almost 200 million doses so far, and Russia, by the way, has only donated 2.3 million doses. At least that was the current thinking from the Duke's vaccine tracker website this morning. I'd point out that Argentina has donated more doses than Russia, although Russia has its own independent product, Sputnik 5, the Gamaleya product. So while you could say that we've concentrated vaccinations in the United States and are now off on the to giving the fourth, a fourth dose of the mRNA vaccine, in point of fact, it's we're leading the way along with the EU in providing doses internationally to protect the rest of the population. Then finally, I'll just touch on the point about whether it would have been morally acceptable to roll out a brand new vaccine in low-income countries first. It's one thing to say that we're at if it were for Ebola or something where all the disease was, yeah, of course it makes sense to roll it out first in West Africa and then later in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. But for a disease in which risk is pretty well distributed, pretty evenly distributed across the world, to have rolled it out first in low-income countries, I think might have been seen as experimenting with lives of people in low-income countries. It's a bit of a convoluted argument, but if these were trials, you would not be able to just do the trials in developing in low-income countries. So that's a kind of ethical issue. You want to share the risk of vaccination equitably across the world, and one way to do it is to start it in high-income countries. First, prove the point there where you actually could deal with side effects, potential side effects, perhaps more expeditiously or more successfully, and then having garnered that knowledge, move on to low and middle income countries. So I think I'll stop there. It's, again, this is a sort of a straight up argument about economics. If you're paying the bills, creating the market, and you want to have this stuff in the private sector, as opposed to the government sector, you need to have markets, you need to have capital investment. And that means that you're going to have to, this will end up going to high income countries first. And the second, I think, big thing to say is that we have the world economy is heavily driven by high income countries' economies, US, North America, Eastern Europe, the EU, and Japan, Korea, and China. And especially in the cases of Japan, Korea, EU, and the US, protecting those economies protects the world economy. I'll stop there and take my lumps now. And thanks very much for having me. So back to you, Tom.
Thanks, George. Excellent response. But now it's time for rebuttals. So I'm going to hand the mic back over to Fatima to respond to some of your points, and then you will have a chance to respond to those. So Fatima, back to you.
Thanks, and thanks, George, for being willing to take all the different punches that are going to come your way, because I think the irony of this debate is that it's not a hypothetical. The arguments that George has actually shared with us are the actual arguments of people who run COVAX. and people who run, different G7 countries and people who run pharmaceutical companies, because there is an assumption that people in the global north are more important than people in the global south. And, we can call it racism, we can call it colonialism, but the bottom line is that 1.5 years or 2 years into this pandemic, with multiple safe and effective vaccines, 2.9 billion people still need a vaccine, and most of them are in Africa. And these were the same arguments we were told around ARVs, that you wait in line, you wait your turn. And so what we had was a drip feed of supplies for the better part of 2021, when we went through wave 1, wave 2, and wave 3, with a lot of death and a lot of cases, and basically an absolute assault on the front line, which healthcare workers had to withstand. I mean, the unofficial death toll is 20 million globally. In South Africa, it's estimated to be at least 300,000 people. That's the new data that's been issued by the Medical Research Council. And so I want to go back to this thing about America first, or France first, or Germany first, because that's really what we've seen. Australia, Canada, the EU, the US, what we call the hoarders, right, of vaccine supplies, is that you started off saying that there would be solidarity. You said to us, participate in clinical trials. We took part in 4. We're about to take part in the 5th trial for Moderna. For companies that have not prioritized us for supplies, for companies that have not prioritized us for knowledge sharing, and for companies that have not prioritized us for access. We're doing a trial for Moderna, but they have not submitted their regulatory dossier in our country. They refuse until the New York Times broke a story about selling supplies to low-income countries. So the risk was socialized, solidarity was promised, and then the total opposite happened. Because we were told whoever finds a vaccine first would share. That was the assumption of participating in the clinical trials. And all of your money, public money, was actually put on the table for Operation Warp Speed. Similarly, in the EU, in many other parts of the world, public money was put on the table to get the entire world out of this pandemic at the same time, because the WHO had warned that unless everyone is vaccinated at the same time fast enough, we're going to just be dealing with this pandemic for years to come. I mean, all of you are the scientific and clinical experts in this. So what we were told was, like George said, wait for COVAX. Do you know what COVAX did to my country? For the better part of 2021, at the end, we only got 1.3 million vaccines from them. Most countries did not get their supplies from COVAX up until late 2021, and you've already administered your first and second shot. And there's multiple reasons for that. But even COVAX prioritized based on income and based on geography. COVAX has a tiered system. It has a tiered pricing system. And rich countries that bought up all the supplies, it's been documented by Human Rights Watch, by October 2020, had already bought up the world's supplies of vaccines, also hedged their bets on COVAX. So COVAX had to prioritize the customers who also put the money on the table. COVAX was not the solution. We've called it, one of the greatest global injustices of our time. We've challenged Seth Berkley on this. That model of donations and please sir, can I have some more, actually did not prioritize the people who are most at risk of COVID in Africa by far, to the point where COVAX could not get sufficient supplies, could not get sufficient funding, whatever reason you want to, there's multiple reasons for this, but by the end of 2021, they were 400 million doses short of their initial target. And their target was already quite low. They were only going to vaccinate about 20% of people if they could in low-income countries, and even that target was missed. So I just want to end off by saying that the reason why we say that if you control production at a national level, and not at the global level. And if you don't let people benefit in the fruits of scientific knowledge equally across the world at the same time, in the same way that you have from Operation Warp Speed, or in the same way that the EU has from the investments in Pfizer and BioNTech, then that is the reason why we have this issue of scarcity, and then how do you distribute scarce supplies in the pandemic? And I really believe that the WHO has been saying that, the SAGE principles, experts have advised that when you have scarcity, the risk prioritization framework has to be healthcare workers first, then everybody over 70. I think these were the SAGE guidelines, and then people with comorbidities. And what we had was the total opposite. which is why when you were getting your second shot, people with comorbidities in South Africa, a person 35 living with HIV, was still waiting for their vaccine. So COVAX, unfortunately, was not the solution, hasn't worked in the way in which it was supposed to. And in fact, many of us believe that it has been a stranglehold for our ability to access vaccines in a timely way. I mean, the point about this pandemic is we can have all the vaccines, you know, in the world. You can have multiple vaccines that are approved by multiple regulators, but we're not getting it at the same time as the rest of you, only because we just told that we must wait last in line. And nobody has still given me a good enough public health reason as to why it's good enough for you to have got your vaccine in January 2021, and I had to wait until July 2021 to get my first shot. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima. Now I'm going to turn it over to George. But before, George, you jump in for your rebuttal, I'm going to remind everyone if they have comments, and I'm monitoring some of those in the chat, but you can raise questions as well, use the Q&A as well. Thanks. Over to you, George.
I think the one major take-home lesson for our audience is, first of all, don't debate lawyers. The second is, let me just say as a practical point, you know, Fatima makes many good points, but they're theoretical. We do not have an example of where we've started something, had a worldwide problem, and started off with the lens of giving something to everybody equally across the world. It just hasn't come up. This could have been the example of it, but it's not exactly a tried and true way. WHO, with the public health emergencies of international concern, has a fairly narrow focus on that exact outbreak, that exact problem, and how we're going to control it and basically contain it. I think that's a much better way, a much better investment than trying to, you know, have this sort of means of production where we could drop 14 billion doses of a vaccine equally around the world at the same time. As attractive as that is, I think it's an idea at this point in time. Fatima's actually absolutely right. This is not a hypothetical. This is happening right now. These decisions are being made, and I think that we could have worked towards something that was a little bit more equitable early on, with trying to vaccinate healthcare workers preferentially, and perhaps the elderly preferentially. We would have gotten somewhat more traction. However, it's still going to come down to means of production and to what we have and who's going to pay the bills, whose taxpayers are paying the bills, and what their expectations are. We live in a very fractious society in the United States and Western Europe and Brazil, other places. And, you know, how much of this we're able to do, given the fractiousness of our societies, I think remains to be seen. I would also just make the point that this idea of having the luxury of being able to close your borders and deal with this has some appeal, and but it catches up with you and eventually bites you, you know where. And I'm thinking very specifically of New Zealand now, that actually had this wonderful, perfect surveillance system, but now is having thousands of cases a day as Omicron runs through its population. So I think that it's, you know, at the end of the day, we need to reach a practical solution where we can protect, where we can try and achieve some degree of equity across the world for perhaps the elderly, perhaps for healthcare workers, and then we'll have to that would be kind of a first step, and then we could work from there. I would also just make a final appeal that if you're, as those of you in the audience are getting a first or second booster and feeling guilty about it, there's a wonderful organization called Get One, Give One Worldwide, where you can make a small donation, which is basically the cost of your vaccine, and that goes to COVAX, as imperfect as it is, to purchase vaccines and distribute them. So I'll stop there, Tom, and let's go back to Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you, George and Fatima, for really excellent, informative discussion on this topic. It's obviously very difficult, and both of you brought up some very important issues that are relevant. George says a lot of the issues that you mentioned are theoretical and in the ethical framework are very appropriate. But how do we make that work in a future pandemic appropriately? So let's go through some of the Q&A. I'm trying to stay neutral on this. So one person, Andressa Penna, in the Q&A actually said, I'm curious about the patent issues. Since it is a global issue affecting all countries in this case, why couldn't we overcome the patent rights so that more companies could have provided vaccines at the same time? How is it right that a patent right is more important than thousands of people dying? This is a global emergency. Could it have been waived? So Fatima, you're shaking your head. Yes, that would be appropriate. Do you want to respond? And then over to George, because George, you did bring up about the capitalistic system. And that's what is driving the engine of technology and the development of these vaccines. And they need to recoup some of those costs. So it does come down to patent issues in a lot of ways, because if countries could start manufacturing these, then it levels the plane a bit. So Fatima, your response, and then George.
Thanks. So, I mean, I think that George is right about capitalism, but the irony of this pandemic is that at the beginning, we were told a different model was going to apply. We were going to socialize the risk, right? Which is why public investment and philanthropists put money on the table to accelerate vaccine research. So there was an expectation that we were going to respond to this pandemic in this global context very differently. The unfortunate thing is, while the risk was socialized, we all participated in clinical trials, public funds were put on the table, philanthropists put money. The idea was to share the technology, to share the know-how of whatever would have emerged. The unfortunate thing that happened is that conditions were not imposed fast enough, and that allowed access to be privatized. And that allowed obviously, I mean, you've all seen the numbers around the profits that pharmaceutical companies have made in this pandemic, especially the ones that are holding on to their IP. So not all, but most of the front runner vaccine manufacturers. And so the access and the profit was privatized, but the risk was actually socialized. And the net result of that is this situation right now, where you don't have enough manufacturers in the world who could benefit from shared knowledge and tech transfer because of the desire to hold on to all IP rights, including patents, and there's copyrights, trade secrets, confidential information. And had there been an earlier agreement, and you all know that the TRIPS waiver has been dragging on in the middle of a global pandemic with 20 million people dead for 17 and a half months, and has been blocked by a handful of really, really wealthy nations. The waiver was an attempt to address this very issue, because we've been through this before in HIV/AIDS. If you don't have sufficient supplies in the system, you can't make enough vaccines to get it out to as many people as possible. And the irony here, George, around quality control, or where those factories are and who's putting the money on the table, is that in the middle of South Africa's wave 3, and this is the part that makes us really angry. You have Macron bringing in his vaccines on his presidential jet. And then we find out that the vaccines that we were filling and finishing for Johnson & Johnson in South Africa, in the Eastern Cape, 30 million of those doses were sent to Europe, were diverted. Because those were the priority customers. They were the VIP customers, the first-class passengers. So the way in which, the prioritization happened and the allocation was so distorted. And then we were told that Africa's not that hard hit. Africans are vaccine hesitant, Africans, can't make good quality control vaccines. Just the last point, and that is down the road from me, is the first WHO mRNA hub right? Which has been established to try and reverse engineer the mRNA technology, not just for COVID vaccines, but for HIV, TB, and malaria, issues that really affect our continent. What do you have in March 2022? Two companies, obviously premised on a very capitalist profit accumulation model, Pfizer and Moderna, refusing to share the technology with the hub. And here's the irony, is that mRNA technology of Moderna is actually owned by all of you. There's a patent dispute currently. It's scientists like all of you that have actually researched that mRNA platform on Ebola, on HIV, that contributed to that knowledge. So there's something fundamentally wrong with our model. It's perverse. You can call it capitalism. You can call it profit accumulation, however you want to define it. We have got to find a way to reverse the way in which we are doing clinical trials and making sure that two things happen. We guarantee post-trial access and that the fruits of scientific knowledge benefit, everyone everywhere in the world at the same time. Thanks, Tom.
Can I just make two quick points? The Biden administration in the United States early on said it would support compulsory licensing of vaccine technology. And since it was the large investor, the US government was the large investor in product development, we kind of hold sway. It's the EU. My understanding is it's the EU countries that have held up compulsory licensing. The second thing is that Baylor, the Baylor College of Medicine, has created its own vaccine. Specifically, it's a subunit particle vaccine, so it's somewhat older technology, somewhat more easily transferable, and has done that without any regard to patent rights. Now, it may not be the world's most perfect vaccine, and it may have somewhat lower vaccine effectiveness, but at the end of the day, it's going to provide a lot of good for a lot of people. Then you get into things of, well, are you going to be keeping the good stuff for yourself and giving everybody the substandard stuff? Which, Fatima, you may not have wanted to make me laugh, but the idea of Macron bringing what we think of as substandard J&J vaccine to South Africa, and you guys getting all bent out of shape about it, I would have said, it was like tit for tat. But anyway, it's we tend to look at somewhat disparagingly at J&J vaccine, although two of my kids got it without asking me first, but I might have. So I think those are two other things to say, that the U.S. has supported compulsory licensing, or at least says it's going to support compulsory licensing. And we have done this extra product development for a subunit vaccine through Baylor. And Dr. Hotez should be congratulated on that.
Yeah,
take it away, Tom.
Yeah, in the chat, there are a lot of comments about this, about intellectual property, allowing vaccine to manufacturing to start to occur in the other countries, and that it should happen faster. George, I was not aware that the rights had been waived, say with Moderna or Pfizer. You've educated me on that.
So Tom, just to be clear, the U.S., the Biden administration, this means the United States, has, and I have a slide about this, so they may have changed their mind. This was more than a year ago, said it would not pursue prosecution of patent infringements in the world for the World Trade Organization. So that in essence says we support compulsory licensing. Now, I may have the details wrong. Again, I will defer to Fatima's greater knowledge of international law, but that's how I can walk around with it in my head.
Yeah, Keith Martin feels very strongly on this, and as I'm going to quote him, public monies paid for the development of mRNA vaccines. The public bore the risk, yet the pharmaceutical companies reap the financial benefit. I mean, you know about Pfizer stock and so forth. And then there's a series following in on that. So, all of you have brought up an important topic about you develop the vaccine within the national realm. Let's put it that way, US, Europe, and so forth. One is distribution, one is donation, and another is manufacturing. And therein is the balance. How quickly can you take this new technology and put it in LMIC countries to really start to expand. But let me add to that debate. In the Q&A, Valerie Fields and Quentin Eichbaum both bring up the same issue. At later stages, it seemed that too many vaccines were being flooded into LMICs, and that the high-income countries were then told to stop sending for now. Could you elaborate on that? That's for you, Fatima. And for George, how does logistics and supply chain issues impact vaccine distribution? Would it seem that we could offer more than the current vaccine doses, but that last mile is a huge issue? And how can our countries, the high-income countries, help the low-income countries for that last mile? Fatima, for the first question.
So thanks. I mean, I've worked as a special advisor to the Minister of Health in South Africa. And one of the worst things you can do to South Africa is drip feed us with supplies for 3/4 of the year and then barrage us with millions and millions of vaccine doses. And that is what happened to Africa last year. There was no supplies, then a drip feed of supplies, and towards the end of the year, when countries who had overbought vaccine supplies, or as George indicates that they were choosing mRNA over some of the J&J vaccines and wanted to donate them before they expired. It's what we call the drip-drip-gush system. So if you have really weak public health systems already, or systems taking strain as a result of multiple waves of the COVID pandemic, and then you start flooding the market with vaccines that are either about to expire or of a different, when you look at the vaccine selection of a particular country, a different product, in addition to the vaccine that a country may have chosen, it obviously creates problems. So look at South Africa, for example. I can give you that as one example, is that we were only able to get supplies from 2 companies. But the first company, J&J, just made us wait, like for at least 9 months there, while vaccines were being diverted to Europe of the same J&J vaccine. And so as a result, most of the people in our country, which was supposed to have relied on a J&J vaccine, easy to administer, once off, not requiring a lot of cold storage requirements, then basically was shifted overnight into the Pfizer regimen, a double vaccine administration program, right? And then what you had was the US government, we don't know why, well, we know why, because of politics, chooses us, for example, as a country to give us 8 million donations of Pfizer. J&J gives us 300,000 donated vaccines with an expiry date within 3 weeks and says, go find 300,000 people and administer this vaccine. They're about to expire in 3 weeks' time. At a point when your country is desperate and on its knees and it really needs vaccines. So the way in which the allocations have been made and how donations have been used as a convenient ruse to say, oh, look at us, we're not nationalistic, we're really clear about vaccine equity, we're making all these vaccine donations, I think has to be interrogated a bit further. And the delays and the drip feed and the confusion and the stalling of trials and the blood clots and the contamination in Baltimore and, changing from AstraZeneca to J&J or to Pfizer, I mean, all of this created a fertile ground for vaccine hesitancy. And I mean, we've been through this with HIV/AIDS before, around how long it takes you to get a community to believe in the science and the evidence. So, one day, I think when we write the book on this pandemic, I think there'll be so many lessons as to what exactly happened towards the end of 2021 that you saw reports of countries in Africa burning vaccines. But there is a deeper story to why those vaccines were being disposed, or where those vaccines came from and how they actually interacted and influenced the vaccine selection decisions of many countries. So, the greatest lesson we've learned is, why did we ask for the TRIPS waiver and the relaxing of IP laws? Is if you don't have sustainable supplies and a predictable supply of vaccine, then you create a crisis in the system around allocation, in a very condensed period of time.
Well, sorry.
Go ahead, George.
Or Fatima, finish your thoughts, sorry.
No, sorry, just the last point was about, the most pernicious form of vaccine nationalism, I think, is not in the allocation of supplies or in the availability of supplies. It's what we call the hoarding of knowledge. So the vaccine nationalism has translated into a knowledge hoarding by multiple vaccine manufacturers that has not allowed other manufacturers to come in. And that's why the vaccine that's mentioned in the chat, which is basically saying we lift all IP, Professor Holt has his work. And the interesting thing there is, this new era of the politics of vaccine selection. Who will select that vaccine for use in a clinical program in which country? So far, I think I've counted there are only 5 or 4 regulators that may have approved that vaccine for use. I think in India is one of the countries. So the whole way in which companies are influencing and how corporate and vested interests are influencing governments and COVAX and the AU vaccine acquisition team into making certain vaccine selections, I think is also linked to the issue of intellectual property and, this agenda of profit making as well. Thanks, George.
Sure. I mean, the logistics of this stuff are complicated, and especially very early on. People don't remember this, but I may not remember this, but at one point, Moderna vaccine was supposed to be held at minus 70 degrees centigrade. And, hardly the sort of stuff that you're going to see in a doctor's office anywhere. And then it went down to minus 30, and then it became sort of a little bit more manageable. Those kinds of logistics are utterly daunting. And if you want to be able to essentially have a proof of kind of a proof of concept ramp up period, it's going to have to be in places that have that capacity to hold vaccines at so sort of ridiculously low temperatures like that. So the logistics are daunting. There's no problem, no issue about that. However, the logistics of measles vaccine distribution were daunting at the time, and we managed to overcome those. We managed to have very high levels of vaccination around the world for measles. And I think that once we get as we've gotten the storage and the kind of cold temperature holds for these vaccines down to those sorts of levels that we achieve with measles vaccine, I think this has become a lot more doable. But that was something that was learned during a ramp up period. And without that kind of knowledge and that kind of adjustment, this whole thing would have fallen on its face.
Boy, there are so many other questions and issues coming along. Fatima, for you to think about, and you can reply to these individuals later. Do we have the same issue with distribution of pills to now treat medications, to treat COVID? How would you draw parallels to how we eventually got over the ARV distribution costs in LMIC? Because we have achieved some equity in that realm. But I know our time, we only have 5 minutes left. So I'm going to do 2 things. One, we're going to quickly do the poll and see how we did. And then I'm going to have you, while we're doing that, think about the final question, which comes from Judy Wasserheit, the former chair of our board here at CUGH, who thanks you for the debate, but with an eye going forward for future pandemics. If you could design a radical new global system, what would be your critical biomedical countermeasures that, and maybe if you could just name a few critical elements going forward. So thinking for the future. Now, let me stop there. You guys think about that. I will do the poll. If everyone could vote, be it resolved, global priorities should supersede national priorities in vaccinating people. The votes are coming in. I want everyone to vote. It shouldn't be that hard. Beginning, we had 77 people voting. We're up to 77 and still going. So everyone stayed tuned in. There were over 115 people signed in that I could tell. But let me stop here so we can close the meeting out with that last comment. 80 people voted, 81% go for the global priorities over national, 19% national. So actually, it does look like Fatima did get a few more votes along the way.
I got one more, Tom. I got one more. Okay, come on.
Yeah, well, okay, because we went up to 80, but percent-wise.
Nobody wants to be like Macron. Sorry, George.
Actually, you guys have, you both have been fantastic, hitting on a lot of issues. But in your last 2 minutes, before they shut us out, you want to comment on going forward? Could we have done this different when we have the next pandemic? How should we do it different?
Well, let me, if I may, Fatima, let me go first because I have some definite thoughts about this. I think that it would behoove WHO or some larger international body to set up manufacturing facilities regionally around the world, and so that as we surmount the intellectual property issues that obviously drive a lot of this and a lot of the, kind of a lot of the complexities of this, we'll be able to manufacture things in areas of need. So some big governments, Brazil, Thailand, South Africa, India, that maybe not governmental in India, but they have manufacturing capacity. And I think it's, we could build that out and make those WHO designated laboratories, perhaps add more, one in Emerald perhaps, and be able to sort of deal with this at the regional level, rather than having to deal with it at the world level, which is always going to be more complicated. So then I think as we negotiate going forward, if there is a codicil to the international health regulations and the treaty that governs it, perhaps we could have some language around suspension or to have compulsory licensing for public health emergencies. But that's obviously something that would need to be done going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, George. Fatima, closing words?
I mean, I think, we can't afford to have a repeat of this. We thought that we were not going to have a repeat after the HIV/AIDS crisis. And what the TAC taught us was that anything was possible. We were told that we would never be able to have a successful antiretroviral program in South Africa. We didn't know how to read time. We would never take our pills on time. South Africa now has the largest ARV treatment program in the world. It's one of the most successful. So I think that with the right political support, with the right, public health support, with the right experts, and with the predictable, available supplies of a life-saving intervention, you actually can turn it around and you can launch a massive public health program. So if you want to go forward and you don't want to have a repeat of this, because this really has been deadly. I mean, this is like the most morally offensive response to a pandemic than, I've ever experienced in 25 years of doing this work. You've got to take medicines out of the World Trade Organization. If you want equity in public health, then we have to address the elephant in the room, which is intellectual property. For as long as we commodify medicines and life-saving technologies and regard it as private property, then we are going to indefinitely have an equity problem. And, George, we have the regional initiatives. The WHO have set up the mRNA hubs. We're not getting the cooperation of the companies. The irony is we're getting your cooperation. Hundreds of scientists and clinicians from around the world basically wrote to the hub and said, screw pharma, sorry for my language, but we're tired of having a system where profit is prioritized, and we're going to share our knowledge and technology with you, whatever we have learned on mRNA. And that is how the mRNA hub has been able to actually make a mini breakthrough within the space of 6 months. So, if you want to get involved, support the hub, support the spokes of the WHO mRNA hub. I think that's going to be critical going forward. Thank you.
Great points to close on. You two have been fantastic. There are lots of compliments to you from in both the Q&A and in the chat. We didn't get to answer all of them, and I apologize to the audience. The time was limited, but I want to, on behalf of CUGH, really thank both of you for taking the time, really putting your heart and mind into this. I hope when the book is written on our response to this pandemic, we truly will have learned from our errors and try and find better ways to streamline the kind of response that you both have been talking about. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for tuning in.